All right, welcome everyone. My name is Sarah Alger. I'm the director of the Russell Museum here at Mass General Hospital. Welcome to everyone in the room and on Zoom. I have a few plugs and housekeeping notes before I introduce one of our speakers. So for those who are new to us, our lectures are typically monthly in the evening. Our next one will be on January 20th. It will be entitled, Did Caravaggio Catch Malaria? Diagnosing Infectious Disease in Artwork? And that will be by an attending physician here at Mass General called named Tommy Hine. And then February 10th, we have our own Lucy Ross. She's the hospital's archivist on, this is the title, The Fairy Godmother of Health Information Management, Grace Whiting-Myers. And then in March, the date is TBD, but the Public Health Commissioner of Massachusetts, Robbie Goldstein, is slated to be here talking about the history of public health here in Massachusetts. One housekeeping note for those of you on Zoom, when there's time for questions at the end, please use the Q&A function. And now I will introduce someone with whom we have the most wonderful symbiotic relationship. That would be Dr. Suzanne Koven. She practiced primary care internal medicine here at the hospital for more than 30 years. She holds the Valerie Winchester Family Endowed Chair in Primary Care Medicine here. In 2019, she became the inaugural writer in residence here. She also co-directs the Media and Medicine Certificate Program and serves on the faculty of the Media, Medicine, and Health Master's Program at Harvard Medical School. Some of you might be familiar with her 2021 essay collection called Letter to a Young Female Physician. And next year, still in 2026, all right, her memoir about being a doctor who became a patient called The Mirror Box will be published. And with that, let's welcome Dr. Suzanne Koven. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Michelle and Mark, and all who support us at these wonderful events at the Russell. Did Caravaggio have malaria? You're just going to have to come to the next lecture and find out. You've heard a little bit about me. You'll hear much more about my dear friend, Natalie. I am a doctor writer. Natalie is a scholar writer. I'm from New York City. She's from the Midwest. There are certain things we don't have in common, but there's a lot we do have in common. And one thing we have in common is that we both had wonderful mothers. And it only occurred to me, like just as I was getting the cheese cubes, that the fact that we had such wonderful mothers may inform the fact that we both write about strong and independent women. You'll hear about Natalie's subjects, and I've written a bit about women in medicine. And I think that's in no small part because of our moms. So I want to start out by telling you one of my mom's best pieces of advice. She said, when you get older, make new friends. And it would be even better if they were a little younger than you. You know, actuarial reality being what it is. So I had the opportunity to make a new friend in March of 2012. Here's what happened in brief. I was writing a column called In Practice for the Boston Globe, and I was reviewing books for them, but only medical books. I begged them, let me review a novel, let me review something that isn't medical, but they wouldn't, because they had plenty of people who wanted to review and they didn't need me to do that. But this was before Zoom and before that thing that I forget the name of it that preceded Zoom with the blue logo. You know what I'm talking about. Anyway, I made a point of going down to the Globe, which was then on Marcy Boulevard, at least twice a year to see the editors in person. And one day I went to the book review office, which was piled floor to ceiling with books, advanced review copies. And I said, please, please let me review a book that's not about medicine. And she said no. And there was a book sitting on her desk on top of a pile that she was practically hidden behind. And it was Clover Adams' A Gilded and Heartbreaking Life by Natalie Dykstra. And I said, how about that one? I presented as my qualifications that I had taken a course at Harvard Extension School in 19th century intellectual history and had written my final paper about Henry Adams and his wife, Clover. Hardly impressive credentials, but I think at this point she just wanted to get me out of the office. I loved the book, which was deeply respectful of a woman who had been considered merely a wife, a suicide, an appendage, and treated her as the artist that she was. She was an early art photographer, Clover was. And then I wrote a rave review in the Sunday Globe. Yeah, right. And then Natalie did something which my mother also told me you should always do. She wrote me a thank you note. She wrote an email, thank you for that nice review. And she invited me to the Mass Historical Society to see Clover's photographs, which she had curated. And then we had lunch. And then the next thing we knew, we were not only friends, we were writing buddies, trading writing, and bolstering each other up. I think if I could tell my mom that I have an emendation to her advice, it's not only make any old friend in your older age, find you a friend like Natalie, who is so smart and so kind and so patient and so challenging. Anyway, so that's me and Natalie. So now here's the sort of formal introduction. Natalie grew up in the Midwest in Michigan and then outside of Chicago. She majored in classics as an undergraduate, and she has a master's in American Studies from the University of Wyoming and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Kansas. Her Clover Adams book was supported by a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and was a finalist for the Massachusetts Book Award. The Boston Globe, that was me, called it a beautifully written and immensely satisfying new biography, which it was and is. Get a hold of a copy. It's really a great book. She's had grants from the Schlesinger Library, the Mass Historical Society, where she was elected an honorary fellow in 2011. She received a 2018 Public Scholar Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities to support Chasing Beauty, which was published on Isabella Stewart Gardner's birthday in March of 2024 by Mariner, an imprint of HarperCollins. She was also supported by the inaugural Robert and Ina Caro Fellowship, sponsored by Biographers International Organization, BIO, of which she is a board member. The New York Times said of Chasing Beauty that it is an exquisitely detailed and perceptive biography. It's all that and more. All of the reviews have been raves, and she also won the Marfield Prize for Outstanding Writing in the Arts, and another prize from the New England Society of the City of New York for writing about art. She's an emerita professor of English at Hope College in Holland, Michigan, where she taught writing, literature, and the arts for over 20 years. Please welcome my very dear friend, my writing buddy, Natalie Dykstra.
Thank you, my friend. That's quite the introduction. Wow. Thank you. Can you hear me? Is this going well? Okay, good. Wow. Thank you. That was really a beautiful introduction. Thank you, Suzanne. It's been my honor to be your friend all these years. And it's wonderful to be here tonight. Many thanks to Michelle and her team. I think I'm getting, okay. Her team for inviting me here to the museum and for taking such good care of all the details. Thank you to everyone here on Zoom for your interest in chasing beauty and for joining me on this cold December evening. A special thanks also to my friend Suzanne, my writing partner extraordinaire. As she described, we first met when she wrote a review of my previous book for the Boston Globe, and since then we've been writing partners. A decade ago, when I was deciding whether to write Isabella's story, Suzanne never wavered, unlike me, who did waver, in her belief that I could do it. We'd meet in a favorite coffee shop in Concord and talk about life and books and writing. And she'd lean over the table and say with great confidence, "I think you should go for it." She read drafts of every chapter over many years, always with an eye and ear for clarity and balance, always urging me to take chances. On the home stretch, her email notes would read something like this one about a draft of chapter 26. She wrote, "My comments are small and either admiring or just asking for clarification, mostly just admiring. Brava, my dear friend." On reading her response, I'd go limp with relief. I can still feel that feeling. Thank you. There's no chasing beauty without you. So Isabella's connections with the MGH are several, principally through her physician, Dr. Henry Jacob Bigelow, whose only son, William Sturgis Bigelow, also a doctor, gave up his practice to live full-time in Japan for a long stretch of time. Sturgis Bigelow and Isabella were friends, and it's his astonishing collection of Asian art that forms the foundation of the collection at Boston's MFA. And we can talk about all those connections more during our conversation. But tonight I want to bring us all to Fenway Court, the name of her museum before her death in 1924, by showing a lot of slides as I read the prologue. Then Suzanne and I will commence our conversation and we'll leave plenty of time for all your questions. So here we go. Prologue, notes on a museum. At the turn of the 20th century, a large palace rose on the edge of Boston's, here it is. A large palace rose on the edge of Boston's Fenway, marshland that would soon become part of a series of city parks called the Emerald Necklace. The plain facade of the four-story gray brick building was skirted on its east side by a high wall. Few people had seen beyond the building's spare wooden doors. When the palace, then known as Fenway Court, opened as a museum in 1903, a surprise awaited the first visitors. Pink stucco walls resembling the exterior walls of palaces lining Venice's Grand Canal and pierced with balconies and arched windows enclosed a stunning courtyard garden. High above, a glass roof let light pour in. Paintings, tapestries, prints, porcelain, rare books, manuscripts, and fine furniture filled 3 stories of the surrounding spacious galleries. Classical marble figures stood tall in the courtyard amid palm trees and delphinium, and at its center was a 2nd century Roman mosaic floor fabricated during Hadrian's rule, featuring a snake-wreathed head of Medusa. Rubens and Holbein portraits, 3 Rembrandts, and a small Vermeer, The Concert, hung on green silk-covered walls. Nearby galleries displayed Italian Renaissance paintings by Raphael and Botticelli, Fra Angelico and Titian. Intricate Chinese embroidery, animal figures made of jade, and a large Japanese screen could be found in another gallery. Painted and stamped leather panels covered the walls of one room, decorated with a large 18th century Venetian mirror, 10 walnut armchairs, an exhibit of precious old lace, and 4 small pastels by James McNeill Whistler. On a balcony railing overlooking the courtyard, a Japanese roof tile in the shape of a dove perched, keeping watch, while the sounds of the courtyard fountain filled the air. Visitors were then, as today, drawn in by the expanse and revelation of the courtyard and galleries, by the way one moves from outside to inside, as if experiencing the light and shadow of a Venetian day. No single artwork appears in isolation, but rather in assemblages or tableaux of historical, cultural, and personal import. Anne Hawley, the museum's emerita director, rightly calls Isabella Stewart Gardner an installation artist because of the way she put artwork and other objects together in unexpected combinations. Francine Prose has written that to step into the museum is to enter Isabella land. Here, one of the most important art collections in America is displayed in a singular and dramatic way. A question posed in a popular journal near the time the museum opened is still relevant all these years later. What manner of woman is she who has built this unique temple of art? Isabella Stewart Gardner, widowed after almost 4 decades of marriage, was informally known as Mrs. Jack, a reference to her late husband, John Jack Lowell Gardner Jr. She had opened Fenway Court just before her 63rd birthday, having imagined and planned for every part of it, from choosing and purchasing the art to collecting the building parts, to supervising the design of the palazzo from the ground up, to applying a sample of specific Venetian pink paint to the courtyard walls. It's one of my favorite images of her on a ladder overlooking the workman's progress. Unafraid of heights. She wrote little about what the museum meant or her reasons for creating it. She preferred to let her visitors form their own impressions, yet she knew very well how much she had accomplished. She said to a friend at the end of her life, "Years ago, I decided that the greatest need in our country was art. We were a very young country and had very few opportunities of seeing beautiful things, so I determined to make it my life's work if I could." She also ensured that future visitors to her museum would see the art in much the same way as those first visitors in 1903, stipulating in her will not only that the museum would be known as the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum after her death, but also that her arrangement of the rooms could never be changed. In her own time and now, Isabella seems like a bright sun. We can look around her, but not directly at her. She radiates, but confuses. A relative remembered how she filled the air, and another thought her charisma was like dynamite. She carried herself with noted sureness, with a, quote, gliding walk, like a proud ship in full sail. Young people particularly liked to be with her because of how she, quote, annihilated the thought and possibility of failure. She had had many advantages. The eldest daughter of a wealthy New York family, she was educated at a Paris finishing school, followed by an early and envied marriage into a prominent Gardner family of Boston. But all this did not protect her from the terrible pain of losing her only child, Jackie. A friend noted her tendency to be self-protective, remarking that she rarely expressed her feelings directly. She was fiercely loyal. She donated large sums to a wide variety of causes without expecting an acknowledgement. Yet she had a reputation for being an attention-seeking busybody, with money enough to boss most everyone around. And Isabella surely relished having all eyes on her. Early on, she carefully collected reports of toings and froings in society, knowing that mentions in the newspapers need not be positive to be good. She was often portrayed as imperious and eccentric. Here she's in her fancy dress, a dress that she's third from the top, on the top, third from the left, in a dress that she had made in Venice. This stereotype, this of being imperious and eccentric, recast her intense drive, her fearlessness, her entrepreneurial skills as something far less potent and disruptive, easier to mock and set aside. She had a method to her work, which she explained in an undated letter. This is her. I'm obliged to correct my steps, that is, to do only certain things and not to add outside ones. I have a great deal of constant and necessary work to do that I can accomplish only in that way. No one, except maybe her husband, Jack Gardner, would have suspected that she could accomplish all that she did. Isabella was a late bloomer, a woman who saw what was expected of her as a Boston matron and decided to be something else. She made sense of her long life through far-reaching travel, avid collecting, and an all-consuming pursuit of beauty, which came to form the through line of her story. The record she left to the world is her Wunderkammer, her world of things. There is a journey one makes at Fenway Court, from the exuberant celebration of earthly life on the first floor with the Farnese sarcophagus and the blooming courtyard, up the staircase to galleries that display the enormous power of queens and kings and popes, to the Titian room, its walls covered with luxurious red textiles named after the painting by the Italian Renaissance master that was one of Isabella's greatest prizes. From this triumphant moment, a turn into the long gallery with its Bardini blue walls presents images of ultimate sacrifice and pain. Botticelli's Madonna, cradling the boy she knows will one day die. Giovanni della Robbia's Lamentation over the Dead Christ, sorrow sealed in Mary's face, and a final turn to the glorious colors of the medieval French stained glass window at the end of a narrow corridor in the small chapel. This is what mattered to her. As one ascends the steps of the museum, one is immersed in splendors of temporal power, but then a turn is made near the end to the spiritual and to everything that can never be contained in a museum. I want to finish by the last couple paragraphs. It will go very fast, I promise. On September 14, 1922, an especially warm day, the painter John Singer Sargent paid a visit to Fenway Court, where Isabella, now 82 years old, lived on the 4th floor, as she had since her museum's opening almost 20 years earlier. Sargent knew the palace well. The two had been friends since Henry James introduced them in 1886. 2 years after that, Sargent's large oil portrait of her, with its ropes of pearls and show of milky arms, scandalized Boston's elite Brahmin society, much to her delight. She invited the painter to live and work for a month at her museum after its opening, which he did using the 3rd floor Gothic room as his studio. She collected a number of his works, including the theatrical El Jaleo with its life-size dancer in mid-step, seemingly ready to sweep across the entire south wall of the 1st floor Spanish cloister. Now Sargent asked to paint his friend's portrait again. He did so quickly in the span of a morning's visit. This is a picture of them taken in 1918, just before her debilitating stroke in 1918. I love this. This is one of my favorite images of her. This debilitating stroke had paralyzed Isabella's right side, and though she managed to dress every day and was able to sit upright, her life had been much changed. She used the hydraulic elevator she had installed decades before to travel from her 4th floor apartment to spend time with her magnificent art collection on the lower floors of the palace. She liked to sit in her office, the McKnight room, on the 1st floor, surrounded by artwork made by her contemporaries, men and women both, with her books and travel mementos near at hand. Here she received visitors and welcomed Sargent, who brought along his paints. Sargent's composition, entitled Mrs. Gardner in White, is a harmony of color and pattern, suggested with light washes of color. Isabella is seated on a sofa against red striped pillows, swathed head to foot in a shroud-like white fabric that frames her face and hides her crippled hand and right side. The painter's genius for depicting draped fabric is on full display. The painting has both clarity and mystery, to borrow Comte-Turvin's precise phrase for what characterizes Sargent's best portraits. He also catches a quality of Isabella's observable since childhood, a powerful force of feeling. If her body and limbs are still, her eyes hum and buzz with life. She had seen much, searing loss, but also accomplishment and great beauty. Margaret Chandler, a friend, thought it was a wonderful sketch of her in this last stage, quote, pale and frail and dominating to the end, noting out how, quote, her green eyes had lost none of their bright malice. Seeing, appreciating, appraising. Sargent pictures Isabella in the here and now, even as her garment references what's to come, but he also renders something of a surprise. In his masterpiece of old age and impending death, he does not forget youth, her youth. A woman's bright lip and cascade of dark curly hair is just visible in the shadow on the pillow behind the sitter's left shoulder. The image in the shadow is as unmistakable as it is provocative. It's as if Sargent is saying that even the ravages of age cannot dim the vitality of who Isabella once was, who she still is. This, then, is her story. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Oh, sort of visual feast. And that's only the beginning. The book is got a lot of amazing images in it. Prose. So Natalie, before we get to Isabella,
Yes.
I want to talk a little bit about your engagement with Isabella.
Yes.
And this is a big book about a complicated person who lived a really long life.
Yes.
She lived to be 84. Your previous subject had died at 42.
Yes.
That's something that we talked about a lot. It's like a lot of stuff happened. And she traveled the world, and her ambitions were large, and her motivations were fascinating. And how did you do it? How do you write a book like this?
A lot of help from your friends, with your friends. You do it day by day, right? You don't do it all at once. And it took me, as you know, you witnessed this, it took me a while to decide whether I had enough of the skills that I would need to tell the story, to do her story justice, basically. And in the skills that I didn't have, could I learn them, right? And so the first thing that I did was to reach out to the archivist at the Gardner Museum, and Shana McKenna is her name. And I was immensely nervous for that first visit, and always the crisis is what to wear, what to wear, what to wear. And so she greeted me very warmly, and she was very happy for my interest in coming. And as I was in her office, I saw a copy of Clover Adams behind her left shoulder. So that was hugely reassuring, because then I knew she knew my work, and knew something of, she knew my earlier work. And so the very first thing I asked to see was albums, anything that was in Isabella's hand, anything that she had put her name in or had underlined, or so drawing books and albums and photograph albums And so in those early days, I kept thinking, there's a better story to tell about her. There's that this material hadn't really been mined as well as it could, in the way that you could.
And we should mention that there hadn't been a real biography for 60 years.
Yes, there hadn't been. The last one was Mrs. Jack. Most of you know that book. And that was published in 1965 and before the 1970s feminist movement, right? And the author is very skillful. She's very smart biographer in many ways, but she's so anxious about who Isabella is. She kind of vaguely apologizes for Isabella's behavior, some of the things that she's well known for. And so it seemed like there was the combination of this archival material and then this new era. It just seemed like there was a better story to tell. And I got very interested in this pretty early in my research. I started to understand that she had this sort of front stage to her personality, this very public persona that she had developed, and that was important to her, and it was important for the museum as well, right? And these are all the stories that we know in Boston, right? Of her walking with lions, and of all her fashion, and the way she was reported on in the newspapers, her outrages and her, and there are some really wonderful stories, but that was really this public persona. And my favorite early photograph, in fact, I saw that photograph of her at her desk the first day I was at the archive. And I was like, oh, that's the woman I'm interested in. Mm-hmm. I was much more interested in the quieter part of her story, because I knew it was from that part of her that she had created the museum. Mm-hmm. And then of course I spent a lot of time in those galleries, right? And I nominate a room, so I'm going to spend an hour in the yellow room, or I'm going to spend 2 hours in the Titian room, and I'm just going to look and see and feel and try to, right? And that was very, very helpful, because I started to realize that the feeling that the tone and feeling that those gallery spaces evoke when you're in them, if I could write a book that had some aspect of that, right, that could rhyme with that a little bit.
Yeah, you've said that the museum is, in a sense, a physical memoir.
Yes, it's a memoir in the form of a museum. And
you were pulling that out. So getting to her inner life, something that in the medical community, nursing community, we probably talk about more than maybe in other communities, is a sense of calling. And of course, every medical school applicant writes on their application about the childhood experience that made them want to be a doctor. I mean, it's sort of standard and often very moving. Isabella seems to have had a calling. She decides when she's about 15, and she's in Italy, that one day she's going to have a museum.
If she has the money.
If she has the money.
If she has the money, she wants to have a palace and fill it with beautiful things.
Where does this come from? She's growing up in a society and in an era where not only is none of this expected of her, but it might have been actively discouraged. Where does this drive come from? Do you have a sense of that?
She's a New Yorker, right? And she was, so she went to school and church right at 10th and Broadway, and they lived right near Washington Square. So this was an incredibly vibrant time of Lower Manhattan in that 1840s, 1850s period. And so there were, the streets were full, right? So she had a lot of visual stimulation when she was a young person. That, I think, was important. And I knew I really wanted to have a strong New York chapter and give a sense of the difference between Boston and New York in that era. So some of it is like, where does someone get a drive? There's a little bit of a mystery, right? There's a personality, I do think she was close to her father. She looked exactly like him. And he would give her these books these beautiful bound, large books, and she kept them all her life. They're in the archive. And they're often of like Shakespeare's women's or queens of the world. They were always depicting, you know, remarkable women and strong women and individuals, you know, like who had a strong individuality. And so that's a kind of message that I thought he was sending her, because it was again and again. It wasn't just one single gift. It was like 3 or 4 gifts that had that theme. And I thought, oh, he's telling her something. And so there was a combination of, you know, its aptitude. I think she had probably a, you know, almost photographic memory in terms of what she saw, right? She could remember what she saw. And she could remember what she heard. Can I talk about just that just for a second? Is music was almost as important as the paintings, but you can't pin music to the wall, right? So, so it's, in some ways it's harder to convey in a book. But when she was old, after her stroke, then young musicians from the BSO would come and play music for her. Can you imagine how wonderful that is in Fenwick Worth? Oftentimes in the Dutch room, sometimes in the petition room, depending, tapestry room, depending. Sometimes in the Spanish cloister, because she loved to sit next to, she loved to be next to the Altaleo. She felt like it brought back so many memories of being in Spain. Anyways, I'm getting off point. The point I was trying to make was these young musicians were starting to play a French composition by a French composer, and she said, "Stop. I heard that 20 years ago at a concert in Paris, and I don't want my memory of that performance to be overridden." So hush. So that means she could hear it in her. She could remember what it sounded like. And I thought, wow, that is really an extraordinary memory. So she had the gifts. It was a constellation of factors. But it is the case also she had an absolute, you know, terrible 20s. The tragedy of her early life is, you can't, she lost all her siblings. She was the only surviving sibling, and her parents. She had a stillborn baby 5 months after marriage. Then Jackie was born. He died at 18 months. She was pregnant one more time, had a miscarriage, and Henry Jacob Bigelow said, "You cannot have more children because it will kill you." So I never knew if she was ever pregnant again. There was no record of it. But so now she's 26. Her doctor says you cannot have children. That is all what's happening on Beacon Street. One of the very first things I did was to figure out how many kids were in each of those houses on Beacon Street, right? Because I was wanting to imagine how many were running up and down to get to the public garden and to the common, and that she would have to watch that, right? And what do you do?
So you went to the census.
So I went to the census, yes. I went to the 1860 census, and Boston has great records, easy to read. And you could figure out 5 kids in that house, and 10 kids in that house, and 3 kids in that house, and right? And so then you could imagine how many were, you know, sledding up and down, right? They love to sled up and down. And then what that must have been like to go to Thanksgiving and holidays, right?
I want to talk about the relationship of all those losses to her chasing of beauty.
Yes.
But before we get there, you were talking about the way her father was supportive of her intellect and her creativity and her strength. Her husband was too.
Yes.
He gave her a portrait of Marie Antoinette. So speaking of messaging, he is a very interesting character, and I'm gonna guess that particularly in book clubs, their marriage is a big topic of conversation.
It is.
It would be easy, I think, to sort of stereotype it as, you know, he was sort of dull and passive and went along, and you know, she was sort of off with the wind. I don't think that was the story. That's not the story you tell. What was that marriage like, and how how did it support her ambitions?
You know, pretty early on, I realized that Jack had been kind of shunted to the side inadvertently. Nobody was like out of malice, right? And that he was sort of characterized as this kind of dull figure and kind of not really worthy of her star power, etc. So, and I just thought that was such a like uninteresting way to frame it. You know, like it seemed like I wanted him to be as fully realized as a character in a three-dimensional way as I was hoping that she would be, right? And so I knew that the Gardner family, he had how many brothers? 3 brothers and 2 sisters, and their papers are at the Massachusetts Historical Society, Gardner family papers, and so that's where I went. And early on, I think it was even before I sold it as a book, because I wanted to hear what those brothers were, how they talked to each other, and how they related to each other, and whether they gossiped about her, right? Complained about her, or wished that she was different, or right? And those letters were amazing, amazing letters, because the brothers were so close and they had such warmth, emotional warmth. And I had written a book about Clover Adams, and the Adams family papers had a very different temperature, much more critical of each other in the letters, much less giving, and just in the salutations, just in the, like Jack's father addressed her, would write to her separately and would say, "Dear, dearest Belle." It was the double dear, right? So then I knew that she had the esteem of her father-in-law. So back to Jack. I think what was so he comes from this close family, right? And he's quite secure in those relationships as he's expressing himself in those letters. And of course they have a very thriving business, so they're investing. Jack's father was bought up all the beacon. He was very much into real estate as those houses were being built up, and but also shipping, and they had inherited money. I just want to say one thing else about the Gardners. Jack's mother was a Peabody from Salem, so that's really where the wealth came through. And so it's kind of the definition of security, right? Those are a very secure family in several ways. And it seemed that he was a very good dancer. He was quite handsome. He was an athlete. And it seemed that there was never a moment of rising jealousy in him in relation to her. And I found that incredibly interesting to think about. And it also seemed that he gave her a lot of freedom and rope and and also that she was the most interesting woman he had ever met. In some ways, he wanted a more interesting life that he was going to have on Beacon Street if he had, right? It's hard, you can't, I mean, Boston after the Civil War is a much quieter place than New York or Chicago, or, right? It becomes quite staid, right? In some ways, socially. And I mean, I think he found her completely fascinating. And at one point he says to a friend, he says, the thing about Belle is she never grew up, but that's part of her charm, right? Her liveliness, her the depth of her feeling, right? He found that all incredibly interesting.
One last question about that.
Do you mind answering the question?
Yes, absolutely. That just occurs to me is, you know, if she designated that it would be named the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum after her death, that nothing would ever be moved after her death. But it required, of course, the Gardner family money to buy all those, you know.
That's interesting.
Yeah, so
Partially.
did she ever consider naming it the John and Isabella?
Okay, so most of the art is really bought through the inheritance of her father.
Okay.
Right? And so when he dies in 1891, she buys the Vermeer in 1892, and then there's this rush of collecting that follows. She inherits 2.7 million, which is a lot in the 19th century, but it's not JP Morgan, it's not the bank, you know, so she's competing against, later she starts to compete against these extraordinary robber barons. But he definitely gifts her key pieces. So the Medusa, which I love, the Medusa floor, that's from Jack, that's a gift from Jack. And of course, he gives her those pearls, those iconic pearls that she wears. And those were, in some ways, a string of those pearls that they bought in Paris. He bought in Paris was 10,000, not 12,000. Was more expensive than some of the art, right? Because she bought her Vermeer for $6,000 in Paris in 1892, right? And so, I don't think at any moment that this project that he enabled in many ways, right, or was the sort of gave her the context in which to pursue it. I don't think it was ever imagined as something that they did that it was his, right?
Yeah, yeah. So one more question about loss and beauty, and then we'll open it up to your questions. So, you know, on the surface, very easy to think of her as an extremely privileged person, and of course,
Yeah.
and of course
She was,
and of course she
and
was.
she would have understood herself to be.
And yet, she had terrible losses. As you say, in her 20s, her 3 siblings all died, 2 of infectious disease, 1 of a brain tumor. She loses pregnancies. She loses her only child, probably from pneumonia at age 2. Jack's brother dies by suicide. His wife, having predeceased him, they have to take in the 3 young sons.
Yes.
One of those sons, when he's a young man, he dies by suicide. There's just loss after loss after loss. And I think a point you make very gracefully in the book is how beauty sat that loss and how the loss motivated the search for beauty. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, especially in the context of today, when we talk about the healing power of art. We've had events here where we talk about that, but it sounds like she knew all about that a really long time ago.
Yeah.
What do you think about that?
I mean, it was a theme you and I talked about a lot, and when I was crafting those chapters, I kind of started to understand it as, I've always been fascinated by that relationship between beauty and loss, right? It was a little bit of theme in my first book, but and I wanted it to be kind of a red thread through the book, right? That it would recur again and again, because it seemed to, I think, a couple of things. Her capacity to respond to what she found beautiful saved her life, saved her emotional life, right? What's so remarkable about her is that she never became cynical, right? She kept growing as a person. That's why I so wanted that Zorn portrait on the cover of the book, because it so captures this kind of opening that she kept doing all her life. She kept making friends in her 80s. Right?
She followed mom's advice.
She followed your mom's advice, exactly right. And so I think her ability to appreciate beauty, respond to it, I think it was nourishment. I think it saved her in a certain way. Her eye, right? And she trained her eye as well, right? She was incredibly sophisticated. She knew immediately what she liked and didn't like. There's aspects of the museum that kind of shouldn't work. You sort of see those columns in the courtyard and they don't match. They come from different palaces, and there's these pieces that are attached on the wall, you know, right? It shouldn't exactly work, and yet it does. It casts the spell, right? And so this is like, I think it was her Harvard education, an education she couldn't get, right? It was this expand. I have that line. She was expanding, growing all the time, and that's what I so appreciated about her. You know, she became more self-reflective as she got older, but in her, she was always outward. She was always looking out, right? And people loved sitting next to her at a dinner table because she would listen so closely. She would lean in. She'd go like this. And people love that, especially the men, right? Right? Because she was learning things, right? She would invite all these Harvard professors to her table, right? Because she couldn't go to their classes. I mean, until she went to Charles Eliot Norton's classes and when he opened that up. But she couldn't go, but she could learn. She could invite them for dinner, right? Yeah. And sit next to them. So, I mean, I think it was her eye was her great skill, her great, you know, capacity, and that, I mean, I think what I came to admire, as I say, is that ability to stay open to the world and not become cynical. That felt like a story worth telling, and you can feel that in the museum. You can feel that embrace of what's beautiful in life, and mysterious too.
You said in an interview.
Am I answering your question, Suzanne?
100%.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. You said in an interview recently, this is the last thing I'll say about this, is something that moved me very much, which is that you said you were quite determined to meet Isabella in her time and not to try to drag her into our time.
Yeah.
And yet, and I think in part by how successfully we did that, she does feel very relevant to our time. I know you won't mind if I tell our friends here that there were times early on, particularly going through the pandemic and shall we say a tumultuous ambiance politically, where you felt like, is anybody gonna care about a rich lady who died 100 years ago? And yet, her expansiveness, her growth, particularly in older age, is so moving and feels so relevant. And the power of art to heal at a time when art is under so much attack.
Yes, and that she still speaks to us right through the museum. So the fact that she doesn't tell you, when I was first starting, I was like, oh, I just wish she had sat down and written 5-10 pages. Tell us what this means. Tell us why the Titian would tell. And now I'm so glad she didn't, because of course she was so smart. She was so smart because she knew that if she had done that, we would look to her and not to ourselves, right? It would date the museum. Isn't that smart?
So smart.
So smart.
So
smart. So smart.
Sarah, do we have questions? And we have questions here. Yeah. Do we need we have a mic.
I've got the mic, and there are two Zoom questions, and we'll start with those. Someone says, thank you for writing this beautiful book.
My pleasure.
They say, I was surprised to find that H.H. Richardson and Frederick Law Olmsted did not appear among her wide circle of friends. Do you know of any particular reason for that?
So Frederick Law Olmsted actually was her neighbor at Green Hill. So she did know him. There weren't as many, there wasn't as much documentation about their friendship. And then it is an issue of me casting. There were so many people in her life. There's 1,000 correspondence. That's not an exaggerated letter So I could only have so many, right? So she did know Frederick Law Olmsted, but there's not a hugely rich correspondence between them. And the second is H.H. Richardson. Richardson, she would have known, and he died in 1884 already. So she did go to the opening of Trinity Church for sure. But her church was Church of the Advent, also in Boston, right here. And I'm trying to think if there would have been any other, that's about what I can say about Richardson.
Right, and speaking of letters, someone else asks, can you talk about her practice of burning letters?
Yes. Well, first of all, this is what 19th century people did. They had a very different understanding of privacy. They would think we were out of our minds to post private pictures on a public forum. And they might be right about that. And they might be right about that. This was not, especially if someone started to become well known enough, they wanted to keep people like me away from, right, biographers. And so as many letters as we have of Henry James, there's that many more that we don't, if you can believe that, it's hard for me to believe. Henry Adams did it. So she was in keeping with her generation. And there is that scene toward the end of the book where someone witnesses, a young visitor witnesses it, that she had a big brass sort of pedestal or a bowl on a pedestal, and she would burn her letters in there. And he happened to come when he could see it said "Dearest Val," and he wanted to kind of reach into there and save that letter. So she was crafting her legacy. It was a way for her to manage how we would remember her. And I think it also maybe had to do with she had said everything she wanted to say. I call it her letter to the world is the museum. That's a phrase from Emily Dickinson. So she didn't want extraneous voices about that, right? I think that's also may have been part of it. And she might have been hiding things, right? That's the thing you can't know as biographer.
We have a question here.
Well, thank you. Is that on?
Yep.
Thank you, Dr. Dykstra, for reviving the life of Madam Isabella Gardner, roughly on the centennial of her passing.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a small comment and a question.
Yes.
And it may bring about nostalgic feeling of the bourgeois lifestyle 100 years ago that was in line with, but posed more grandiose than the lifestyle told in the Great Gatsby. The timeline matched. That's my feeling about what you described. And the question is, did the large and eclectic group of artifacts, how did that group of artifacts reflect her personality? And conversely, how did her personality impact her choice of collections? And within that, did the collection include Mozart artifacts such as handwriting? Since you mentioned that she was fond of music.
Yeah, those are very good questions. If the museum is a memoir, a kind of memoir in objects, what does it say about her, right? Well, first of all, her interests were wide, right? So she was interested in European art, but she also has a very important Asian art collection. So I find that fascinating. She was very, very interested in religious experiences, spiritual experiences, right? So there's a lot of Madonna and Child. That's the most common motif in the museum, but that also is one of the most common motifs of Italian Renaissance painting. So the thing about collecting is it's both your taste and your interest, but it's also what's available on the market. And so there was that moment after Italy unified that Italy was incredibly poor, right? And so they had palazzos filled with all this art, but they had no cash. And Americans had big houses, no art, and lots of cash. And that was that moment. So it was also what was available to buy, right? And once she had this relationship, this friendship with Bernard Berenson, who was her connoisseur, and he was the most important art historian of the Renaissance in America at that moment. And so she had the best kind of guidance as well, right? She had someone she could trust in terms of identifying who these painters are. And so it was a constellation of factors, but then she got very interested in classical art as well, right? So the statues, all the beautiful statues in the courtyard, the Medusa floor, right? So she started to want to have a larger time frame for the museum, right? I think, sometimes people have wanted her to collect Impressionist paintings, right? There's a few early painters, Degas and Manet and blanking on the third one. Matisse is not exactly an Impressionist, later, more modernist. But she wanted to stay focused in her collection, right? She didn't want to, and so many people in Boston were collecting Claude Monets. So she didn't want to repeat that in her collection. Although, boy, would she love to have one of those huge water lilies, would have been very beautiful in the museum. So it was a combination of interest. When she went on this long tour of Asia, then she collected smaller things that she could travel with, like net ski, these beautiful medicine boxes from Japan, screens, fabrics. She loved textiles. She was so smart about textiles. So all the textiles that are in the red room, all the red rooms, that she collected all that fabric on their travels. Right, so it was her range was very wide in that way. Her interest. She loved chairs. There are more chairs. Someone counted them. It's like way over 400 chairs in the museum, right? And at first, when she opened the museum, people would sit in these chairs. So she had to figure out how to tell people not to sit in those chairs.
Was there Mozart artifact?
Pardon?
Was there Mozart artifact in the collection?
Anything related to Mozart?
Yes, there's in the yellow room. I think there is an artifact related to Mozart, but I can't tell you exactly what it is. She definitely has Brahms. She has a cigarette of. I think she has a cigarette butt of Brahms. I think she has, right? So the yellow room is the music room, and you'll find in those cases a lot of her collection. She has Charles Loeffler's violin in there. So yeah, she loved music. And she was instrumental in the Boston context of shifting. It was so dominated by German composers, and she loved the French. So she popularized French composers, Debussy and etc. That's a good question.
So I think we'll take this. Our archivist just said Brahms' cigarette butt is a hard artifact to be.
Yeah. The archivist.
Yeah. It's in a little case. You can see it.
That's awesome. So if mention of the Gardner heist is not off limits to talk about, someone asks, how do you think she would have felt about the heist?
She would have been very mad. She would have been heartsick, especially Rembrandt. She wasn't a huge fan of Rembrandt. I mean, she understood his importance, but that was her favorite painter. But the Vermeer was a very important painting, and she would have been. One thing that I've been very careful about is to not put or speak about her feelings now, right? I can speak about some of her feelings then because I have the evidence for it. But I will say this is what I can say about it. She will be so proud of how the museum recovered. Because that was such a wound. I mean, that you could imagine other circumstances that they would have to close. You know, it just was the fact that they figured out how to recover and that it's thriving as it's never had. You know, I mean, it just reached 500,000 visitors this past year. So that's really extraordinary that it came back from something that was so, and then it's not defined by it, right? It's not the most interesting thing about the museum anymore. It was for a while because it is, right? But it's not the most interesting thing about it. So.
Well, with that, I think we will have to say thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. This beautiful museum. Thank you. Thank you for your interest.
And so at the foot of the stairs, you will find lovely booksellers from the hospital's general store, if anyone wants to purchase a book. And then at the table next to that, Natalie will be signing books. We'll have little index cards and pens for you to write exactly what would you would like them to say in your book.
Yes, it makes a wonderful gift.
This
holiday
season. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.